Thank you. Well, I'm thrilled to be here, if slightly intimidated to be the final speaker after such a tremendous conference. Now, Watts Gallery is an artist studio museum located in the Surrey countryside, just south of London. And it was founded in 1904 as a place to publicly exhibit the art of the significant Victorian artist George Frederick Watts, who, as a point of reference, was born in 1817 and died in 1904. This is the gallery that you can see here, which was designed by the arts and crafts architect Christopher Hatton Turner. But the site also consists of the artist's house, Limnasley's, which contains the studio of both George Frederick Watts and his wife, Mary Watts. This was completed in 1891 by the arts and crafts architect Ernest George. And then finally, we have the most remarkable arts and crafts chapel, which was designed and built by Mary Watts. And it has, as you can see in the bottom corner, the most magnificent and unique interior in Britain, possibly further afield. So please come and visit. But I'm now going to just move on from talking about the site more generally to specifically focus on a current point of research at the gallery. Now, G.F. Watts is best known as a painter, as the, quote, portraitist to the nation, and as the creator of large-scale symbolist pictures, many of which you can see hanging here in our historic galleries. However, from the 1860s and until his death in 1904, Watts dedicated substantial amounts of time to working in sculpture. And I've been looking at this over the course of the last year. I was really fortunate enough in the autumn to spend a month at the YCBA in New Haven to really focus on Watts and British scholarship on British sculpture. And I think it's quite intriguing because during Watts's lifetime, his role as a sculptor was readily acknowledged by many of his contemporaries. Leighton famously referred to him as England's Michelangelo, precisely because he worked in so many different mediums. And in 1901, following a visit to Watts's Surrey house and studio, Rodin referred to Watts as the venerable English master of painting and, crucially, sculpture. However, as Daniel highlighted generously yesterday, by the time we hit the mid-20th century, Watts was relatively unpopular. He had really dropped out of favour, and in many cases when you actually look at contemporary scholarship on British sculpture, he's marginal at best and generally kind of an absent presence. Now, following the artist's death, the contents of both his London and Surrey studios was meticulously preserved by his wife, Mary Watts. And this fragmentary studio collection, which consists of anatomical models, écorchés, preparatory studies, and of course these very large plaster models, is still held at Watts Gallery today. And it continues to be exhibited in the sculpture gallery that you can see here, which was a space specifically designed by Mary Watts for the storage and display of that collection in 1907. Now, with the creation of the gallery, there was a real effort to recreate the essence of that original studio space. She repurposed the large doors that you can see to either side in this photograph from his London sculpture studio. And for anyone that was at Chesterwood, the railway tracks that I was so weirdly excited about yesterday, you can see down in the very bottom of this photo the tracks that we think were brought either from his London or Surrey sculpture studio across to this display space. And as you can see, the two full-scale gesso models for his most monumental projects, Physical Energy, which is the equestrian sculpture at the front, and then Alfred Lord Tennyson at the back, still very much dominate that space. And from the moment I joined Watts, it wasn't these massive sculptures, but the rather weird, fragmented and amorphous sort of lumps that lurk at the back of the cases to either side that really caught my attention. It's rare for that type of preparatory and sort of more like studio ephemera to really survive. And it's, I think, even more unusual to find it preserved in this way. And I think this is where, as a studio museum, the collections at Watts Gallery present a really interesting and unique opportunity. Close reading of the material held here can really inform our understanding not just of Watts's sculptural practice, but his artistic production more broadly. So today I'm just going to draw on a few of the examples that have really caught my attention when working across our painting, sculpture, photography and drawings collections. Now, within Mary Watts's diaries, which are again another meticulous record of her life with G.F. Watts, she makes regular reference to him using clay and wax figures to aid his painting. She describes the benefits that he finds in that change of eye and hand. And we hold an extensive collection of these rather weird and wonderful pieces, many of which can be directly related to specific compositions. And now, when you examine some of these fragments alongside our studio collection, when you look at these preparatory drawings and the unfinished oil studies, you can begin to explore what Marian Spielmann may have meant in 1901 when he described Watts as a painter-sculptor. These studies vary significantly in both size and the level of finish, ranging from small-scale figures like the ones here for HAHS to much larger finished models for more pared-down later symbolist works like Love and Life. The collection also contains these rather fantastic head studies executed in a three-quarter format. Now with these, Watts is not just exploring or using sculpture to finalise form or composition, he is using it as a means to articulate expression. And I think the way in which you can see Watts delineating extremes of emotion here is really quite striking. And this practice thoroughly reflects the art of a portrait painter, I think, who would make studies both face-on and in profile to build up a more complete image of the sitter. And here Watts he's taking that practice into an extra dimension, which is really original and interesting. Now, as this photograph from the archive demonstrates, he would also use his maquettes as a prop, wrapping them up in wet canvas, sometimes covered in covered wet canvas to give greater density in order to create the desired three-dimensional model he was after. And when you look at both our sculpture and drawings collections collectively, you can see how he works from the plaster model here for a work called Love and Death to create a series of studies working both from the nude form and then increasingly more abstract drapery studies. And it's that process of observation and variation that leads to him creating these incredible sculptural dynamic draperies that become really characteristic of his work from the 1870s onwards. Now, I think it's really important to emphasise, though, that Watts is not just using sculpture to inform his painting practice. It's a much more reciprocal process. And Clytie is a fantastic example of how he works on the same idea over a number of decades and it plays with the materiality of that in working in different mediums. Now, from the 1870s onwards, and you can see he's there in his later years there, there's a really significant shift in his approach to working with sculpture, and he begins to work on this really massive monumental scale. And that shift is fundamentally triggered by Watts turning to use gesso grosso, which is a kind of plaster mix where you add in lots of fibrous towel to give it a greater density. And Watts was introduced to this material at the early 1870s by the Italian sculptor Aristide Fabrici, who was working as a studio assistant at the time. Watts couldn't work with clay because he had really terrible rheumatism, so the introduction of gesso grosso was a radical shift for him, and it allowed him to embark on these much more monumental things. Whereas clay can be, it has to be modelled when wet, and so therefore the project has to be completed quickly. Gesso grosso isn't subject to those kind of time restraints, and that was a blessing and a curse, because it can be modelled when wet and then carved when dry, and this process can just go on and on and on. And for Watts, he really thoroughly took advantage of that, and suddenly his sculptural compositions last for decades. And this great photograph that we saw yesterday at the London studio depicts Physical Energy, which is a work he even designed the armature with hooks so that he was able to take it apart and reposition it. And this went on for decades, 30 years. And in Mary Watts's diaries, one day she's marvelling at the, quote, energy and power of Physical Energy. 2 days later, we're told that the rider is now headless, armless, a maimed, sad creature, presumably destroyed in some sort of fit of creative despondency. But then, literally a week later, the rider soon had a new head and a thickened torso, but she tells us Watts felt like hacking it all to pieces again. So it really gives an insight into the impulsive way in which he's working. He's not just executing a pre-planned design like a lot of his contemporaries, but really allowing these ideas to mature as he sees them evolve on the armature itself. Now, gesso also allowed Watts to really experiment with texture in quite new and innovative ways. Here you can see early versions of Tennyson's head that have been abandoned within the sculpture collection, and there's a real shift from this very naturalistic smooth finish to the finished gesso and the bronze, which are much more variegated. And I think stylistically, this is worlds away from the hyper-smooth naturalism of Watts's British contemporaries in the new sculpture movement at the time. And it perhaps raises the question of a broader international perspective, which is something I'm still very much looking into. Now, during Watts's final years in the 1890s, there is another interesting shift as he moves away from the classicism represented by Phidias and the Parthenon fragments that underpinned his sculptural work until this point, and became far more interested in the archaic. And this reflects, of course, a much broader shift in the relationship between art and antiquity that is fundamentally led by the excavation of lots of very early Greek sites in the late 19th century. But for Watts, it was also thoroughly triggered, I think, by his 1887 honeymoon with Mary, where they spent months travelling through Greece and Egypt, and her sketchbooks provide the most fascinating, rich record of the wide variety of archaeological sites that they encountered during that time. And that, of course, reflects in the evolution of physical energy. And over the 30 years, it was repeatedly photographed. So our photography collections provide this fantastic record of how it grows and changes. And it moves from something very Phidian, in particularly the shape of the horse here, to something far more angular and archaic. And in the final work, we find exaggerated flat planes, a simplified anatomical structure, both in the horse and the rider, a pronounced emphasis on musculature, the same very experimental approach to modelling and surface texture that we saw with Tennyson. And this was, for Watts, who was the great sort of boring Victorian to the mid-20th century, this is a really radical sculpture for him to have produced. Even in 1904, when this was first cast and exhibited at the Royal Academy, this would have been totally at odds with anything being produced by his British contemporaries. Now, physical energy, actually I'm going to leave that for a sec. Physical energy is one of only 2 sculptures that Watts ever exhibited during his lifetime, which is slightly problematic. And this led Benedict Reed, the famous art historian, sculptural art historian, to refer to the relatively hermetic circumstances of Watts's sculptural practice. He suggests that the absence of Watts's sculpture meant that there was just no way really that he could have influenced others. And I think that fundamentally underestimates the role that the artist's studio played in fostering artistic networks. We know from the volume of surviving letters and Mary's diaries that Watts received countless visitors during his time both in London and Surrey. The sculptors were Leighton and Hamo Thornycroft just lived round the corner, and of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, Rodin, when he came on his sort of grand tour to see all the established British artists, made it all the way down to Surrey to go and see Watts. Now, while he may have been unpopular in the mid-20th century, in the 1890s, Watts, that was really not the case. Watts was a subject of fascination and even celebrity, and he regularly featured in reports in the contemporary press, both within the UK and much further afield. In 1882, a letter was published in the New York Times describing a visit to Watts's studio, and the journalist reports not just on the paintings, but on the, quote, colossal figure of Hugh Lupus, which was an early equestrian statue of similar scale to physical energy. And then in 1898, nearly 20 years later, a studio visit is followed by a report in the Times where the journalist comments on the colossal equestrian statue of energy and force. So while it's true that Watts rarely finished anything in sculptural terms, let alone exhibited them, his work would have been accessed by a wide range of artists and the general public at large, because you could just go and visit artist studios, and in London by the late 19th century that was a very popular thing to be doing. Now, physical energy is kind of key to this work on research, obviously, which is why in 2017, to mark the bicentenary of Watts's birth, Watts Gallery Trust commissioned a brand new cast. And here you can see it in the Foundry at Pangolin down in Wiltshire. This was then exhibited in the forecourt? Oh, they don't like that. The Annenberg Courtyard at the Royal Academy, marking both our 200th year and their 250th anniversary. And this is, of course, where the first cast was shown in 1904. And this summer, this cast will arrive at Watts Gallery, where it's going to be installed on the edge of Watts Gallery's estate beside the A3. So now, from later on this year, every time you drive from London to Southampton, you will see Watts's greatest, most monumental piece of sculpture. So obviously the creation of this new cast is partially what has led to this broader reassessment of Watts's sculptural practice. Physical energy is, without doubt, his most monumental and publicly exhibited example of his sculptural achievements. But I think it's perhaps in the fragmented and ambiguous remains of those abandoned projects, the ones that were broken up in a fit of despondency that often lurk at the very backs of our cases, that we see how the interests of maybe early modernists were thoroughly embroiled in the artistic, aesthetic and intellectual experiments of their Victorian predecessors. Thank you. I just want to say one more thing. So, sorry, just to reiterate, the Artist Studio Museum Network is a European-wide organisation, and this is our website. Next time you're anywhere around Europe, please visit. As of next month, we're launching a new part of the website that allows you to look for studio museums near you, wherever you are around Europe. So please make use of this. And finally, before I give the microphone back to Valerie, I would just like to, on behalf of all on behalf of all the Brits, I would just like to thank you so much for having us. We have had just the most fantastic, rich and informative and enjoyable time. And so thank you very much to Valerie in particular, who has dealt with 101 email queries from all of us in the lead up to this, but also to HAHS in general, and of course the Terra Foundation for funding this. And we look forward to welcoming hopefully all of you to our sites at some point in the near future, and some of you hopefully to the autumn event later this year. But I'll let you say more. Thank you.